Good morning or afternoon, whatever time it is that you're watching this. This is my second attempt at a social studies lesson, and we're going to be talking today about the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th, 1775. The last thing we talked about was Paul Revere's Ride and the battles of Lexington and Concord, which was in April of 1775, April 19th specifically. Well, remember the militia, the rebels, well, the Americans, if you want to call it back, the colonist militia, had driven the British back here into Boston. And what I didn't talk about a whole lot was the fact that the Americans, the militia, had set up um, on this hill right outside of Boston. They'd set up all of their camp, and several thousand men, by some accounts, as many as 15,000 militiamen, while in Boston there were about 5,000 um, of the British Army. But so the British couldn't come out of the Roxbury Neck or the Boston Neck because they would come under fire from the Americans who were up in here. Now, the British were not what's called under siege. They could get in and out because they had all the ships here in Boston Harbor, so they could get supplies in, they could get more men in, all that stuff. The Americans really didn't have any way to fire on these ships. Um, but what General Gage realized is that all around Boston there are these hills. Now, of course, this there was a little hill here called Roxbury Hill where the Americans were dug in, so to speak. They were behind a wall of dirt. But there are also a couple hills up here in Charlestown, the Charlestown Peninsula. There's also a big hill up here in Dorchester. Now there's a hill over here, but that's a little far away from Boston to be able to actually shoot into Boston. Now, when we talk about shooting, uh, these hills, you really need a cannon to be able to shoot that far, and a good sized cannon. But of course, we know that the Americans had captured a bunch of cannon um, in come on, Ticonderoga. There we go. So I just want to show you briefly. Come on. I want to show you briefly. Sorry, still trying to work this out. Show you briefly. Boston is here. We'll do some in green. Why not? So there's Boston Harbor, and then Ticonderoga is way up in here. Whoops, I'm sorry, wrong spot. Whoop. Ticonderoga's way up in here, a little bit farther up than I was thinking of. And Fort Ticonderoga is where on May 5th of 1775, Ethan Allen and his boys had captured the fort, and there were a lot of cannon there. And there was a guy named Knox who decided he had this plan to bring those cannons all the way down into Boston. The problem is it's over 200 miles, and they had to go across some mountains in here, and it wasn't easy to move things because there weren't really roads. There were like muddy tracks. But anyway, it was going to take a while. However, General Gage knew that those cannons were coming, and the colonial militia knew that the cannons were coming. So what they had, excuse me, what they had planned to do then, the colonial militia um, in June of 1775 decided that if they could take this area here, Charlestown, Boston is, whoops, Boston is over here. It even says Copp's Hill. That's the hill right there. Um, but there's some pretty good sized hills here on the Charlestown Neck. Charlestown is right here, and if you remember, Charlestown shore, right around there, was where Paul Revere waited to see the lantern. So you could see from the Old North Church, and you could see Copp's Hill, you could see down into Charlestown. Now, there is like I said, a pretty significant hill here on the Charlestown Neck called Bunker Hill, 110 feet tall. Now, unfortunately, it's a little farther away. There's another hill called Breed's Hill that's just about half as high. But what the militia did is they came in June and they staked out on top of Breed's Hill. And when I say staked out, they actually built what you call a redoubt. And a redoubt, I want to take just a second here and show you some pictures of the redoubt, is built out of dirt. And you'll see some of these pictures. They have the logs sticking out of them. And they probably didn't have time to put the logs sticking out of them, but they built up this massive dirt, a line really of dirt. Now, some of these redoubts are pretty extensive. Like this one has all the different, like almost like tunnels or a maze going through it. So there are lots of different walls you can sit behind. But the redoubts that were built by the colonial militia were likely just a line of dirt that was on top of, well, first of all, on top of Breed's Hill here, and then on top of Bunker Hill there was another redoubt, but I keep getting these weird things. Anyway, the redoubt probably would have been like along here, and then there would have been one here, and then they built another redoubt all in one night, according to what we read. Right here, there was a rail fence right here, and they actually built a redoubt just behind that rail fence. So all the way from the edge of Breed's Hill all the way to the water, they built this long line of dirt. So now we come to the morning of June 17th, 1775. The cannons on top of Copp's Hill over here, but especially the cannons on the warships, all started opening fire. And you can actually see even the lines that were drawn on this old map. They were all shooting at Breed's Hill. They actually opened fire early in the morning before the sun came up and just started pounding Breed's Hill, pounding that with massive amounts of cannonballs. Of course, the militia who were behind the dirt wall were safe, but it had to be incredibly noisy and scary and whatnot. And also the eyewitness accounts of what happened that day said that when the sun finally came up, the smoke from all of those cannons opening fire was just ridiculous. You couldn't see anything. So when the sun finally came up, now the British stopped their firing. We'll take that out of there. And the Americans, the militia, knew that, something's probably up. So the militia's all very ready up here. And what the Americans didn't know was that the British Army, while all this firing was going on, had unloaded something like 5,000 men in this area here, right behind a little hill called Morton's Hill. So they were out of sight. They did that under cover of darkness. When the sun came up, all of a sudden they started marching about 1,000 men, about 1,000 redcoats in their full uniforms with those bright red heavy wool coats, marching them down here toward Charleston. Well, when the American militia colonial militia commander saw that, they said, well, we better send some guys down here. So they sent a few guys down here, and they basically met in the middle and started shooting at each other all through Charlestown here. But what the colonial militia, the Americans, the rebels, didn't know was that the British had kept back something like 3,500 men here, and they came out, and when they were engaged with the Americans already down here, the rest of them finally came out and started trying to march up Breed's Hill. Now, this was, well, it was started out kind of a suicide move, because as they marched up the hill, all the Americans are sitting here at the top of the hill, right up here, leaning over with their muskets. What's going on here? Anyway, sorry. Still trying to figure all this out. So they're leaning over with their muskets, and they're shooting down at the British, who are marching up this hill. Now, the British all, of course, remember, they all march in this big, long line. So it's like this line of men coming up, and for the militia sitting up on top of the hill, it's just like a shooting gallery. Boom, pick them off as they come up the hill. So the British have to fall back. They retreat, go back down to the bottom. And the officers, now the officers are the guys who give the orders. The regular soldiers are just what you call infantrymen or enlisted men, and they don't do anything unless the officers tell them what to do. So meanwhile, the Americans have pulled all their men back. The British pretty much take over Charlestown, but the real prize is up on top of Breed's Hill. So now the British mount a second attack. They come up here again, and again they are turned back by the militia, by the rebels up on top of the hill. And by this time, we're getting to the middle of the day, and it's June in Boston, and it's getting hot. Now, these British soldiers are wearing these big red wool jackets, coats, and there's almost as many of them like falling over, fainting from the heat and the exhaustion, as there are that are getting shot by the militia. So finally, they have to fall back again, and this time the officers tell the men, all right, look, take your coats off. Why they didn't do that before, I don't know. The British Army really, they're kind of stickler for order, and you got to do things the right way. Well, anyway, they start coming up here a third time, marching up, this time without their coats on. And by this time, the day's hot, and more importantly, these guys up here on the hill are running out of ammunition. So a lot of the American militiamen take off, they fall back, because they know they're about to be overrun. There are a few guys who say, not running, staying here. And by the time the British get to the top of the hill, they're actually fighting with the bayonets and hand to hand, and it's basically ugly. But the Americans that stay here, the militiamen, are all either killed or taken captive. The few that fell back, or the ones that fell back now, start to line up here along this ridge as the British now march down and are trying to get the Americans off of Bunker Hill. By the time this happens, the Americans know that they're badly, badly outnumbered. They also know that they are very, very short on ammunition. So what they do is they line up their guys at the top of this hill, the top of this berm, this dirt line that they've built, and the commander the American officer tells his militiamen, do not fire. Don't waste your bullets, your musket balls. Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes marching up this hill. So the British start marching up the hill again, big long line, because that's the way they do things. And the Americans wait and wait and wait until the British are almost right on top of them. Then they start shooting. But they don't have enough ammunition to actually turn the British back. So what happens is the Americans fall back, they lose that position, and they realize that the British are going to be coming. They're just not going to stop. So the Americans actually fall back and abandon Bunker Hill and head back out to join up all those militiamen who were outside of Boston guarding the Roxbury Neck, guarding the land way into Boston. So June 17th, 1775, it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill, even though most of the fighting really took place here on Breed's Hill. But Bunker Hill was the real objective. The Battle of Bunker Hill, the British won, but it cost them hugely. They lost approximately 3 times as many men. The Americans lost a little over 300 Americans' lives were lost, or 300 soldiers. The British lost more than 1,000. And a high percentage of the British losses were officers. Now remember, the officers are the ones that gave the orders. The enlisted men, the regular soldiers, if the officers didn't tell them what to do, they didn't know what to do, and they didn't do anything. So it was huge. It was a victory for the British, but it cost them huge number of officers, and that came into play here. Now, at the end of the day, the British still do control this whole area here. And that's important because now the Americans can't put their cannons up there, but they've lost a huge number of officers. Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th, 1775.